So, the period that we're going to look at here is going to be the expanding arms trade system, and roughly Lawrence defines it running from 1966 to 1980. Now, the boundaries and environment of this time of this era of arms transfers, again, is going to be from 66 to 80, and it's going to be characterized first by a loosening of the bipolar political system that kind of leads to more intra-block arms trade rivalries. So we don't see this so much in the West, but we do see this as far as the U.S. or the USSR and China is concerned. So China becomes a arms exporter within its own right. It's beginning to really fund and provide arms to North Vietnam as well as to North Korea. And there is this break as far as ideology goes between Mao and the Soviet leaders at the time. So even though both states are proclaiming to be communist, there's so much ideological differences between the two countries that they're beginning to break their foreign policy goals, and China becomes a competitor in arms transfers to the USSR. Now, when we shift back towards the West, you see France as really, in you read the chapter on the French export system a couple weeks ago. France really, once it rebounded, it really took arms transfers as a tool of foreign policy, more importantly, a critical tool of national security. The only way for France to guarantee its security at that point in time was to export arms to bring money in to keep their own domestic defense industry running, because they saw a domestic defense industry as key to being an independent nation. It did not necessarily want to be controlled by the US. So you also see the rise of French exports coming into play here, which some of the transfers run counter to what the US is trying to do with their own transfers. So you are seeing these intra-block arms trade rivalries occur at this period of time. There is a continuing East-West conflict, which does fuel arms trade, but it shifts from Europe to Asia. So we are seeing Southeast Asia with the Vietnam conflict and with different ideological conflicts going on within that area. We look at Cambodia, we look at Laos. But the majority of arms transfers are going to go towards Asia and Southeast Asia at this point in time, and it really shifts from Europe. So essentially, the U.S. and Russia empowered their power blocks within Europe during the past time period, and during this time period, they're really beginning to go out towards more of these proxy conflicts within Southeast Asia. So you see lots of arms transfers going to Asia at this point in time. Again, going back to the French example, economic recovery in Europe results in increased competition. So now many of the states like Great Britain and France have recovered from the war. The Marshall Plan worked, right? Great. But you also created competition within the arms transfer system during that period of time. Now they had the money, they had the ability to produce arms, and for France, export was key to their national survival. They linked it directly with it. So they had to export to survive. So now you have another competitive nation competing with arms transfers coming from the US. Petrodollars and the rise in oil prices, especially during the late 1970s, means more recipients. So basically, the entire Middle East at this point in time, you look at, and Iran isn't necessarily part of the Middle East, but you look at the countries within that region as far as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, all of them begin to really profit from the trade in oil, and they used a lot of this money to fund the acquisition of advanced military systems. Now, the increased cost of systems and the uh, surge of petrodollars increased export behavior. There was so much money out there that states that could export were really looking to export to kind of reap all of that money within the system. Now let's look at the characteristics of the units during this period of time. What Lawrence finds is that the suppliers are national governments. So again, you're seeing the shift from the pre-World War II period in which multinational, or not multinational, but firms dominated the market. Now suppliers are national governments. They aren't going to be these private firms based within the state. They're going to be the government itself. Lawrence also shows that multinational corporations began to emerge. Now, by 1975, James was reporting on 6 multinational aircraft programs and 5 missile programs during that period of time. So you're seeing this rise of multinational corporations. And this also reflects the fact that when we're looking at the more high tech, the cutting edge types of military equipment being transferred during this period, it's incredibly expensive. And for some of these smaller states, they can't necessarily afford to do it all themselves. So they create these multinational corporations to help pay for the acquisition and the production of advanced arms. Lawrence also finds that the ratio of exports to production increases dramatically. So there is a huge demand for arms. So the countries that can produce arms, especially those high tech arms, are beginning to produce a lot more for exports than they did in the past. Now, the recipients are going to be primarily developing countries, but they're also going to be increasingly unconnected from East West conflict. But they are going to be connected to regional conflicts going on at that point in time. So, if you're looking at states which are receiving arms, when they're in conflict, it's not so much a proxy conflict having to do with East-West values, but often the recipients are going to be countries engaged in conflicts which are regionally based and not really connected with kind of this political ideological conflict which is going on in a bipolar system. Now, this is what's really interesting about this period when we look at the structure and stratification. Arms transfers have increased by almost 400% during this period compared to the previous period. This also shows why states like France are looking to export because there's money out there, right? So you're looking at arms transfers blow up during this period. We also see that the number of suppliers doubles. This is important because states coming out of the wreckage of World War II are now able to have their own money and produce arms. They aren't necessarily trying to spend all the money to climb out of the wreckage, right? Now they can actually produce arms and go to sell them. China is also on the market as well. So you're seeing these large state of the art producers like France and China really come into the fray now and provide competition within the global arms market. The US and the US and USSR are now competing against European suppliers and developing industries. So what we also see during this point in time is developing nations are really tossing a lot of money into domestic arms production because they don't want to be reliant on anybody else for the supply of arms. So they're beginning to kind of create these cottage industries to basically build these smaller arms. Most of these states can't produce primary arms like planes, tanks, bombs, but these very basic things, trucks, guns, and things like that, they can. So you do see a large number of states begin to produce their own arms. What we also see is that there's a proliferation of advanced weapon systems around the globe. Remember that there's so many states now participating in the arms trade that it's really becoming about a buyer's market. So if you're looking to sell, the one way to really sell a lot is if you guarantee the export of advanced systems around the globe. So we're seeing countries like Ethiopia and Somalia receiving arms that usually only the US and Russia would receive themselves for domestic procurement. But part of the reason for that is that the U.S. and Russia that are still competing in kind of this bipolar political game have to be able to offer more high-tech arms than they did in the past, because states like Ethiopia and Somalia would look at the U.S. and go, well, if you don't give us this advanced arm, then I'm just going to go over to France or I'm just going to go over to China. I'll buy it from them, right? So you do see this proliferation of advanced systems across the globe. You also see a shift here from Asia, right? Remember during the last point in time when you're seeing the shift from Asia and from Europe to Asia, now it's going kind of from Asia to the Middle East. And that's also because there's a large amount of petrodollars that are revolving throughout the arms trade system, right? It's who has the money is going to get the time and the weapons. Now let's take a look at the modes of interaction during this period. Lawrence finds that cash and credit become the dominant forms of payment during this period. So we're moving from a grant aid period in which the US and Russia had a lot of surplus arms and they just gave them out, to more of a cash and credit type of system. So now we're going back to kind of this pre-World War II, post-World War I system in which you had to have the cash. This is also because the majority of importing states during this period of time, remember, especially when we look at the Middle East, have a lot of cash to spend. So cash and credit become the dominant forms of payment. License production also increases importantly in the developing world. So remember, during the last time period, license production was occurring, but it was primarily occurring in these larger, more developed nations within Europe, or, well, I guess it would just be within Europe, really. But you're seeing the license production also move to more developing nations at this point in time. Co-production also increases, which is really interesting. So you're seeing countries that also want to take part in developing these weapons get into co-production. This is important because this shows that these developing nations, the reason why they also want co-production is because they really want that knowledge transfer that tends to come along with it. So co-production of more advanced systems. We also see, again, going to multinational production. So not only are you seeing these states being forced, these supplier nations being forced to give out licenses for production of arms, but also participating in co-production of arms to be able to capture sales. You're also seeing multinational production go on because these, especially the more advanced arms, are becoming incredibly expensive. So the modes of interaction here are changing drastically from the period before. So now let's take a look at the regime norms and rules. Lawrence starts out with conflict, and what he finds is something interesting. During this period of time, superpowers begin to find it difficult to control conflict due to the proliferation of suppliers. Because there's so many suppliers on the international arms market, the US and Russia no longer have a monopoly on the supply, which means that they can't necessarily use arms as effectively as a tool of coercion or foreign policy. So when a conflict does break out, it's going to be a lot more difficult to control because there's a multitude of suppliers. So even if the US and Russia don't supply arms to a particular conflict, most of those countries that are participating in the conflict have a number of other suppliers to look to buy arms from, which aren't necessarily going to care that they're in conflict. Places like France, places like China, right? So that increased competition also allows states in conflict to ensure supply. They can go out to other supplier nations to make sure that they have the ability to buy arms. Now, this also ties into foreign policy and diplomacy. Arms transfers are increasingly ineffective in influencing recipient behavior, especially within the short term. So if we're looking at countries within conflicts, again, states are finding it more difficult to use arms transfers as a tool of foreign policy and coercion. Why? Because the state can just go to somebody else to buy arms. This goes back to resource dependence theory in, I believe, the first lecture of the course. The more options that a state has to import arms from, the less dependence they have on any one state, and dependence equals power, right? That's why the US usually only wants to be the only player in town with a certain country's imports. Because then, if they're the only supplier, they have a lot more leverage and they can coerce the importing state a lot more easily. During this period of time, with the influx of suppliers throughout the globe that aren't necessarily tied to this East-West conflict, countries can pretty much have their choice on where they want to import arms from. What are the economic effects? Well, major arms producers must export or die at this point. There's so much competition going on that it's become a buyer's market. The suppliers now have to basically conform to what the buyer wants. So you have to export or you die. And remember, during this point in time, especially when we're looking at the major suppliers like France, like the US, like Russia, they aren't directly involved in conflict, right? So the domestic procurement isn't going to be as high. Well, the U.S. is of course involved in the Vietnam conflict, right? But for most of these other prime suppliers, they aren't directly involved in conflict. So that domestic money for domestic procurement that's going to your arms manufacturers isn't necessarily there, which means you have to export. If you don't export, you're going to have a really rough time. You're also looking at a lot of the other arms suppliers, which are smaller in stature, which don't even if they were in conflict, the army doesn't have enough procurement money to keep those industries in business. Therefore, they must export in order to survive. What they also find, or what Lawrence also finds, is that licensed production doesn't lead to interdependent arms production. which is really, really interesting. So what it also shows is that this license production also isn't necessarily creating a lot of other competition. So it's finding that although states are looking to license produce or even co-produce stuff, it's a lot more difficult to basically get your own domestic arms industry off the ground through that method than most states thought it was. Now, when we look at arms trade control, national control has increased again, right? Nations do fully control the arms exports coming out of their nations. Even places like France, who look to export to almost anybody who has the money, France still has the last say on whether or not a company within France can export arms. So national control is really, really tight. Now, if we look at the multilateral export control regime, we find that it's resisted by exporters because of the need to export and recipients because of national security considerations. So now when we're looking at conflicts, we are seeing that the UN is calling for multilateral export controls. But the problem is that there's so much money out there and such a need for states to export arms to survive. You're seeing this multilateral export control regime basically getting brushed off. It's going, okay, well, the UN wants it, but I want to go get my money. And you also see recipient states resist it because they look at multilateral export controls and go, you're saying that I don't have the right to protect my own state. Therefore, I ain't signing a darn thing from you that says that I'm going to be controlled on some type of weapons system. So you have both sides, both the supplier and the recipient, resisting these multilateral export controls, which are being proposed by international institutions like the UN, because of different factors.